Hi everybody. This lecture we're going to be looking at some preliminary theories to ethics and really norms that govern our behavior. And within the normative universe, there are different ethical norms when it comes to how we act. And that can include how we ought to act, what our duty might be, rights, what is permissible, if we have obligations. And all of these different norms are associated with different behaviors and justifications. Here, for instance, you can see a couple examples of the different types of norms within our behaviors. So we might think of behavior based on a practical standpoint. Jim is deciding whether he should invest his money in gold bullion, mutual funds, or government bonds. So this is a question of practicality. We also might look at behavior from a legal perspective. Vanessa wonders whether it's permissible for her to turn right on red in this particular state. We can also look at it from an aesthetic or reasonableness point of view, and you can see how our behavior is kind of governed in different ways with different types of justification. So when we're making ethical choices, it's important to understand this normative universe. What is it that we are expecting our behavior to be in a given situation based on whatever that justification may be, whether it's legal, reasonableness, or so on. Here, you can look at these different scenarios and think how you might behave in this instance, and from that, maybe provide a justification for why you think that's the case. Here are two other ethical choices that we often think about, some of us have to deal with. And so, again, think of what your justification may be, what type of normative behavioral decision you're making, or think that someone ought to make in this given situation. Now, when it comes to the decisions that we make, there's two real main approaches to making decisions. And this is going to take up the next few lectures when we're talking about different ethical theories. The big three coming later. This time we'll be looking at egoism. Next lecture will be moral relativism. And egoism and moral relativism are preliminary theories because they're often associated with how we might instinctually feel or instinctually think what should govern our behavior. But when looked at philosophically, there will be many problems. There will also be many problems with the big three that we're going to be looking at later. Those big three include utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and deontology. But when it comes to decision making, right, there's two main approaches, and these two main approaches are going to essentially govern all our different decision making, morality, ethical decisions. We can either base our action on our gut instinct and intuitions, feelings, or we can base our actions on some rule, code, or set of principles. And this is how we typically make decisions. And so thinking about which one of these might be better, maybe it's going to be some sort of combination of the two. Either way, these two approaches are going to be kind of the focus of the next few lectures. And so here we might pose the question, right, is it better to act on principles or intuition? When we think of principles, right, if we think of codes that may dictate our behavior, we can see that this, in instance, could be problematic because if you have bad principles or rules, then you're going to get bad results or bad behavior. So if we think of, for instance, Osama bin Laden acting on principles, we might think, oh, well, we don't like those particular principles, or we don't like some set of principles. And so is it necessarily good to have principles, and what would really classify a good principle over a bad principle, and so forth? Now, we might think that intuition then will guide us in the right direction. However, the problem with our intuition is that our sympathies might be short-sighted and narrow. So, for instance, a mother taking a child for a shot who feels badly for the child, right? I might feel as though my child shouldn't be put through pain to get some vaccination shot. However, that short-sightedness is really essentially bad behavior on the parent's point of view, right? It would seem as though the moral, ethical decision to make would be to uh, give the child the shot, make the child go through a little bit of pain uh, for the short term in order to protect that child from long-term effects of some sort of um, infection or um, different kind of problem that could be solved with just a simple vaccination. And so the proposal that we typically think to use is to essentially kind of create this moral principle based on moral intuitions. And so we're going to try and combine these two. We're trying to use our intuition to carve out these different principles or rules, which will essentially be the focus of the next few lectures. So again, talking about the big three kind of um, ethical theories: the golden rule, the golden mean, and the categorical imperative. We might think of um, these different these different behaviors that will be kind of guiding principles to help us. So before we get into those three big theories, it's important that we look at a couple others. And again, we're going to look at these because there is some level of intuition that goes into them. And a lot of us are going to like how egoism or moral relativism sounds. And in fact, if you turn on the news, if you follow along and with current events in social media, you might see an overwhelming majority of people acting in accordance with moral relativism. And so when we look at egoism and moral relativism, egoism is essentially that morality is someone's own personal code. You might think that because everybody is different, we all have different beliefs, and what is right and wrong for me may not be right and wrong for somebody else. And this, again, has some sort of intuitive feel to it. I might think that some sort of action is right or wrong, and someone else might think that that action is the opposite. And it's okay because morality, what is right and wrong, is within us, the individual. So I might be in favor of capital punishment, somebody else might be against capital punishment, and there is no necessarily wrong or right behavior. It is just based on your own personal stance. Now, moral relativism is very similar, however, it's expanded. And instead of being a kind of personal code or individualistic, morality is based on what society uh, says or what our culture says we should be acting like. So in America, we might think some sort of practice is wrong, while in India, they might think a specific practice is right. And so what's right for us is not necessarily right for India. What's right for India is not necessarily right for us. We kind of have our own system of beliefs, and those systems of belief guide our actions, and they don't necessarily always need to line up. And so again, with moral relativism, we don't see a kind of right with a capital R or wrong with a capital W. These are subjective based on either the individual with egoism or the society with moral relativism. And so when we look at something like egoism, for instance, we have this kind of understanding that morality is our own personal moral code. So morality is what we believe it is individually, and everybody has his or own moral code. Again, there's something intuitive about this. It's something respectable about every individual being able to choose for themselves what is right and what is wrong. However, if we look at morals in this individualistic way, we see that morality becomes incredibly subjective. And the problem with morality being subjective is that everybody can justify their own behavior regardless of the outcome of the actions. So here we have two very different quotes. One from Conan the Barbarian: "What is best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women." And take that opposed to Ayn Rand's: "The achievement of his own happiness is man's highest purpose." Now, these couldn't be more different. However, based on egoism, we see that because morality is subjective, each of these is right for the individual. And for some of you, this might be right on, and others might think that this is problematic. And it is going to be problematic in a certain aspect, which is typically why when it comes to morality and ethics, we think of egoism and moral relativism as this kind of preliminary theory, in that it's not a very well-received position, even though this is fairly common with how we act. So within egoism, there are two different types of egoism that we're going to look at: psychological egoism, meaning that everyone acts in his or her own self-interest, and ethical egoism, which is that everyone should act in his or her own self-interest. Now, one of these essentially is just saying the psychological egoism is that anything that you do is the best choice for you, which is why you've done that choice. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, is that we sometimes act against what is best for us. The goal is how we ought to act, though, right? We all have these rules or principles that govern our own subjective feelings of what is right and wrong. And so sometimes I will act against those positions. And so we'll look at these two examples. For instance, if we look at the idea of psychological egoism, the idea that everything you do is for your own self-interest, we run into problems by seeing that there are times when certain acts are in fact selfless. Now, for some that take the position of egoism and understanding our behavior as being everything that we do is based on our own self-interest, and that there really is no such thing as selflessness, there are a couple examples that might be problematic. For instance, the example of Private Ross McGinnis, who was an individual within the military who threw himself on a grenade to save 4 other soldiers. Now, he sacrificed his life to save his friends, and in doing so, we see that Private McGinnis did something contrary to his own interests in this instance, right? When we think of jumping on a grenade, Private McGinnis paid the ultimate price in order to save others. And so we can see an instance here that might be problematic for psychological egoism, and this idea that there is no such thing as selfless actions, and that every action is one in which a person is acting on their own best interest, because we see these instances where there is true selflessness, or someone forgoes their self-interest for others. We often can see this too with just simply having children. It's the case typically that children make parents less happy statistically, and yet people continue to have kids. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that having kids makes you unhappy. However, again, statistically, through Gilbert's evidence, we find that this is typically the case. So again, we continually do things that go against our self-interest. And so we can see that psychological egoism is somewhat false, right? We want to maybe look more towards ethical egoism and the idea that we ought to do something based on our own interests rather than everything we do is within our own interest. However, there are also problems with ethical egoism. And the idea with ethical egoism is it leads to really bad consequences, for instance. And we can see this within examples of J.C. Lee Dugard, who essentially was enslaved and kidnapped and raped. And based on this idea, we might think, well, if your desires are to kidnap and enslave somebody, then if you think that's right, then based on egoism, that is what is right for you. Now, I might disagree. I might think that you shouldn't kidnap, rape, or enslave someone, and that is wrong to me. And this kind of clash seems incredibly problematic because while it may be the case that I think that people's beliefs of right and wrong are subjective, I don't really want to accept the idea that kidnapping and enslavement is right for anybody. And in fact, I want to make sure that this is thought of by everyone as being wrong. I do not want this to happen in society. I would like to create laws to prevent this kind of thing. But under the grounds of ethical egoism, your belief and my belief hold equal weight. Same thing with the instance of Kristen Diane Parker, who was an individual who stole pain meds from cancer patients and infected dozens of people with hepatitis C. So again, in Parker's perspective, what she is doing is good or right. Meanwhile, I might want to say, no, that is a very bad and wrong thing to do. And at the end of the day, we want to essentially say that what she is doing is wrong, is unacceptable, and therefore kind of curb that type of behavior and dissuade others from behaving similarly. So we can see with ethical egoism that this level of subjectivity between individuals creates certain problems because if everybody has their own understanding of right and wrong, then right and wrong cease to have a meaning, and then creating society with rules becomes very problematic because essentially there is no basis for any particular rule since everybody is right about whatever their beliefs dealing with behavior are. And this is also leads us to the fact that tastes differ drastically. And so there is no real principle of humans doing what is in their best interest. We all have vastly different tastes, vastly different understandings on how the world is. And with there being so many people in the world, this will essentially lead to 8 billion different belief systems on behavior, which again can get very problematic when trying to sort out society and governance and so forth. In addition, ethical egoism violates the principle of equal treatment. Now, the principle of equal treatment is essentially a principle that states that two people should be treated the same way unless there is a relevant difference between them. However, if we were to go off of ethical egoism, we would see that this doesn't really matter, for instance, right? Think of how a court case works. We go to court and a court decision sets precedents. And so when a similar type case comes before a judge, we can simply just refer back to the precedents and the court case will be decided because equal treatment between two people should hold if there is no relevant difference between them. And so imagine if we were to look at every single trial individualistically and see that regardless of the fact that you were drunk driving and killed a random passerby and were convicted of manslaughter. In this case, we would have to hear every single excuse and take into account all the different factors that go into drunk driving and so forth. And it might bog down the court system and be a waste of time in that if the consequence we look at is the same, namely an innocent life is taken because of drunk driving, then there should be some set punishment. But with ethical egoism, it doesn't really seem like that would be the case. And so it creates this kind of problem in that we start treating people differently based on similar experiences or actions, and therefore we can get to creating a very unequal treatment of people. And the goal of many societies is to uphold the principle of equal treatment, make sure that people are treated equally, and so forth. And so when we look at this first moral theory, we see that even though it's instinctual to feel like my right and wrong isn't necessarily any better or worse than anybody else's right and wrong, this line of reasoning can really get us into trouble, thinking that morality is so subjective. Because if that is the case, then there really is no right or wrong, and the justification for laws, the justification for our behaviors, kind of go out the window, and we have to accept the good with the bad.